Okay, let's pick up where we left off last time. We were talking about Pop Malthus, talking about the problem of overpopulation and the scare that I can remember from my childhood and the difficult discussions I had with uh, my mom on that issue, which I talked about in the last session. But as so often is the case, if you've been in a debate club or in an intense discussion, that quite often whoever defines the terms wins the debate. Whoever defines the terms wins the debate. And I found that that tends to be true in this overpopulation economic debate as well. So let me just take the bull by the horns and throw out a definition to see if I can help the discussion take it to the next step by offering a definition of overpopulation. And you have to tell me if you think it's a fair definition or not. My stipulated definition of overpopulation is more people than the land can sustain. More people than the land can sustain. Sounds workable? Sounds fair? More people than the land can sustain. Now, if you grant me that definition, then I would argue, well, you just tell me, from your opinion, do you think New York City is overpopulated? No. No? Pardon? Oh, the city. I'm talking about the city itself. Is New York City overpopulated? Just what would most people say if you don't want to? Yeah, some people would say yes, maybe. How about when the Pilgrims landed here? Was the New England area overpopulated? No. I would like to give an argument to show that the reverse of both of those is true. That when the Pilgrims landed here, this country was overpopulated at the time they arrived. Yeah, that's going to be hard to prove, right? But I'm going to have to go back to my definition. More people than the land can sustain. And I'm just trying to give you an historical illustration here. As I recall a portion of that colonial history of the United States, they didn't land where they intended to land. They were wildly off course. They got a really hard winter. Things were really bad. And unfortunately, they didn't have enough supplies, and they were required to share everything communally, and that didn't work out very well either. But one day, there was this Indian that walks into the camp. His name was Squanto. Said in great English, "Hi, Englishman. You got any beer?" They just crossed the little puddle. You know, there's this Indian dude walks in English, asking if they got any beer. Kind of strange, right? Not the normal thing that happens. Well, as things turned out, evidently there had been ships there before, and they had looking for stuff, and they got to have something to sell when they get back, and they didn't find any gold or anything, so they offer some trinkets to some native Indians and lure them onto the ship, and then anchor them down and take them back to Europe and sell them as slaves. And so at least they get some of their stuff to pay for part of the trip. And this was one of the Indians that had been enticed onto the ship and found himself in Europe someplace and sold off a slave, and some guy bought him, and he bought somebody else and wound up in London and was taught English by this English person, and they became good friends, and he eventually gave him his freedom back and sent him back to his home people because he cared about him, but he knew all the pubs and he had been around there, so he wanted some beer. He hadn't had any good beer for a long time. And so he walks in there looking for some English beer, and anyway, his whole tribe had been wiped out when he got back, and they had been wiped out because of overpopulation. Now he knew how to bury corn and grow things and all this sort of stuff, and he taught them a lot of tricks. But the the Europeans that came here, brought with them a technology that was part of the most revolutionary technology in terms of health that the world known. You see, the indigenous American Indian had to travel light, and they go through the seasons and go through the winter and falls, and if it's in the middle of the winter, you go outside your tent and download and get back in where it's warm again. And by the time spring comes, there's something called bad spirits. Ooh-wee, bad spirits. And you know that when bad spirits come, it's time to get out of Dodge. You got to leave, or everybody's going to get really, really sick. And so you got plenty of game, plenty of stuff to eat, but you got to stay on the move. You can't stay in any one spot for any too long because bad spirits are catching up with you. We got to get out of here, right? If they don't, epidemic, plague, whatever. And it just so happened that his tribe died. They just died out, epidemic, whatever. But when the Europeans came, they brought with them a technology that looks kind of like this. With a little path to it. Been to Grandma's house and they got one, maybe an outhouse. An outhouse. Now, with this particular health invention here, the European could come, they could build a cabin, they could build a barn, they could clear the land, they could stay year after year, generation after generation, and they could accumulate capital because they didn't have to move. They weren't on the move constantly, so they could build up a house and they could continue to use it year after year, and a barn and fences and all that sort of stuff, and they could build a legacy of more and more and more and more tools. They could accumulate tools where the indigenous Indian did not have this technology, got lost, and so they could not do that. Now, because the Europeans came with this technology, the land could sustain a lot more people than the technology and the lifestyle of the American indigenous Indian. And that's why when the Pilgrims first came, the Indians were dying off because of overpopulation based upon primitive technology that they had. They didn't have this yet. But when the Europeans came with additional sanitary technology, now the land could sustain lots more people. Does that make sense to you now? Similarly, I would say that if there was one person in the middle of the Sahara Desert is overpopulated. Why? More people than that land without water can sustain. So again, it all depends on who gets to define what overpopulation is. If overpopulation is simply more people than the land can sustain, well then we could say New York City is not overpopulated as long as we can keep the electricity flowing. If the electricity ever gets cut off, then all of a sudden it is instantly overpopulated. But until then, no, people aren't going to die off in droves because they're not overpopulated. Okay. The next thing with overpopulation has to do with our view of human beings. Are they an economic asset, or are human beings an economic liability? Malthus tended to look at human beings as a liability, as one more mouth to feed. To quote an unfortunate line from a guy named Henry Kissinger, there are people who are, quote, useless eaters, unquote. I don't like the phrase. I'm not happy with it at all. But I'm saying, yeah, there are some people who view other people as useless eaters. So when we look at human beings in terms of an economic view, there's two categories. Do we have a situation where for each additional person they consume more than they produce? Or could it be that for each additional person they produce more than they consume? Yes, indeed. If we have an increase in the population of a group of kleptomaniac thieves that aren't productive and the only way they stay alive is by stealing from their neighbor, then yes, one more of those kind of people who use up the scarce resources available without producing anything to sustain themselves or produce something for anybody else, I'd say that person is a drain on the economy. We got to get rid of some people so that we got whatever's left, we got to share it with less people. We got to get rid of them and them and them so that there can be more and more for us. So yeah, we don't want any more of those people. We don't need them because we got a fixed supply here, and there's not any more, and we don't want to be sharing our pie with any more people. But if we have a society in which each additional person actually, over their lifetime, produces more goods and services than they consume, then each additional person makes you and me wealthier. Because there's more stuff because they're here. We could look at individual examples like our text talks about Thomas Alva Edison and the great things that he did to electrify and bring electricity technology to this country. I would beg to differ. I would say it was Nikola Tesla rather than Edison. Edison really got in the road. But if we didn't have these entrepreneurs, if we didn't have these people who made these advances, we would all be poorer rather than wealthier. So there's where the debate comes down. If indeed we are a society of thieves in which we have no social capital to care for the assets of our neighbor, or we are neighbor's keeper, in the infamous words of Bob Dylan, the pump don't work because the vandal stole the handle. If you remember, you wouldn't remember that. You're too young to remember Bob Dylan. Anyway, Ron, you might remember. The pump don't work because the vandal stole. Now, if we have a society of thieves who prey off of each other, yeah, increased population it's a curse. It's just a curse. But if we have a society where everyone tends to increase the welfare of everybody else, well, then that's a completely different matter. But notice I'm emphasizing here the ethics of the social capital involved in the nation as to whether more people are a blessing or whether more people are a curse to the economy. Malthus, from the time that he passed away till now, has been proven wrong. And economists have speculated over why he's been proven wrong. And they don't point to my argument here that people in civilized society who are not out and out continuous criminals who just prey on each other. They would cite the fact that increase in technology is not linear. Of course, you got him and her, and together they produce, I'll say 4 kids, and then together this couple produces 4, and some other couple produces 4 more, and you get this exponential effect going here. Yes, rabbits multiply, kind of like human beings multiply. Our population gets getting bigger and bigger. But is that a blessing or a curse? And why didn't Malthus's prediction that we're all going to starve to death come true? And that is because technology expanded at a much faster exponential rate than even technology growth. Now again, if we lost our technology, and that's possible sometimes, if the lights go out in New York City and there's no more electrical power, people are going to have to leave or there's going to be mass casualties because the trucks have got to get in there, the water system, the sewage system has to work, or it's going to be a death trap. But as long as we have the technology working, it's fine. It can keep on going. I suppose they can build higher and higher skyscrapers and keep on going, keep pushing the water out further and further out. But as a matter of fact, Malthus did not foresee the idea that technology could produce such a high increased standard of living, in which technology actually drives, as we saw with our $4 for apples, actually drives the prices of goods and services down. At the same time, there's more and more people who want those goods and services. More and more people want computers. At the same time, we're getting more and more computer for less and less money, and that's the way the economy, from a supply side, Say's law productivity perspective, would come from. I've got one more comment or two on the classical growth model, and then we're going to jump into the monk strategy.